Imagine the worst-case scenario. 42 days after the cascading electromagnetic pulse turned every circuit board on Earth into worthless silicon, Marcus Chen stands in the skeletal remains of what used to be Interstate 90 outside Spokane, Washington, staring at a teenage boy whose lips have gone from pink to blue in the 18-degree morning air, and understands with absolute clarity that the knowledge in his head is the only thing standing between this child and a frozen death by nightfall. The sky hangs low and grey, choked with ash from the nuclear plant failures that followed the grid collapse, creating a perpetual twilight that's dropped temperatures 20 degrees below normal for November and turned the Pacific Northwest into a frozen wasteland where summer will not come again for years. The boy, whose name is Daniel and who is 15 and whose parents sent him alone toward the rumored safe zone in Montana before they succumbed to radiation sickness, has been walking for 6 days on a dislocated ankle that's swollen to twice its normal size. And Marcus knows from his decade as an Army Ranger medic that without intervention, without shelter, without fire, this kid has maybe 8 hours before hypothermia shuts down his organs, one by one. His own pack contains a Mylar emergency blanket, a steel canteen, 20 feet of paracord, a ferro rod, and a fixed-blade knife, the entire sum of his survival equipment after trading everything else for the antibiotics that saved a pregnant woman's life 3 days ago in the ruins of Coeur d'Alene. The wind cuts through their clothes like surgical steel, carrying the chemical smell of burning refineries from Seattle, and Marcus spots something that makes hope flare in his chest. A massive culvert pipe, 8 feet in diameter, half buried in the embankment beside the highway, and surrounding it a dense stand of cattails and dried grasses that most people would walk past without a second glance, but that he recognizes as the raw materials for a thermal shelter that could mean the difference between life and death. The temperature is dropping 1 degree every hour. The sun, what little of it penetrates the ash-choked sky, will be gone in 4 hours. Daniel's core temperature is already compromised. Marcus can see it in the way the boy's hands shake, the way his speech has started to slur, the way he keeps insisting he's not cold when his body is screaming hypothermia warnings that his oxygen-starved brain can no longer process. This is the moment where knowledge becomes action, where training becomes survival, where a 35-year-old man who has lost everything except his skills must transform dead grass and human determination into a refuge that can hold back the killing cold. If you connect with my story, please press the like button to find some light from this survivor's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next life stories, and tell me about them in the comments where you are watching this video and what time it is right now. It makes me very happy to know that from any corner of the country or the world, you are listening to me. This is the story of Marcus Chen, a 35-year-old former Army Ranger and survival medicine specialist who spent the first month after the electromagnetic pulse searching for his daughter in the chaos of a collapsing Seattle, only to discover that the elementary school where she'd been during the pulse had been evacuated to somewhere unknown, leaving him with nothing but questions and the crushing weight of not knowing. With no grid to power communication, no internet to search for information, no phones to call, Marcus became a ghost, moving eastward through the Cascade Mountains, following rumors and refugee trails, trading his medical knowledge for food and his survival skills for any scrap of information about school evacuations, heading toward Montana. In the frozen wasteland that the Pacific Northwest had become, where the ash from 3 nuclear plant meltdowns created a perpetual winter and temperatures plummeted to deadly levels, Marcus found himself doing what the military had trained him to do, keeping people alive when everything in the world conspired to kill them. He moved through survivor camps like a prophet of practical hope, teaching water purification to former lawyers, showing shelter construction to software engineers, demonstrating wound care to teachers and accountants who now lived in a world where a simple infection could mean death. Every person he saved, every technique he taught, every life he extended was a prayer to the universe that somewhere, someone was doing the same for his daughter Emma. But he never stopped moving east, never stopped searching, never stopped hoping that the next camp, the next group of survivors, the next piece of information would be the one that led him to her. The boy Daniel collapsed against the concrete embankment, his breathing shallow and rapid, his eyes struggling to focus, and Marcus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with emergency medical situations. Time compressed into a series of critical decisions that needed to happen in precise order, each one dependent on the one before, each one essential to keeping this 15-year-old alive long enough to see tomorrow. He knelt beside Daniel and placed 2 fingers against the boy's carotid artery, feeling a pulse that was too fast, too thready, the body's desperate attempt to circulate warming blood to vital organs even as peripheral circulation shut down to preserve core temperature. The kid's core was probably around 94 degrees, maybe lower, dancing on the edge of moderate hypothermia, where confusion and poor decision-making became deadly companions to the cold itself. Marcus pulled the mylar blanket from his pack and wrapped it around Daniel's shoulders, knowing it would buy them maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour, but understanding that passive insulation wasn't enough when the ambient temperature was 18 degrees and dropping. They needed active warming, which meant fire, but more critically they needed shelter that could trap and hold the heat that fire would produce. The culvert pipe offered a dome that would prevent heat from escaping upward, but without insulation on all sides, it would simply become a concrete refrigerator, conducting precious warmth directly into the frozen ground through the principles of thermal transfer that killed more hypothermia victims than people realized. He moved quickly to the cattail stand, pulling his knife from its sheath and began cutting the brown stalks at ground level, his hands working with the automatic efficiency of someone who had done this dozens of times before. Cattails were perfect insulation material because of their structure. The dried stalks were hollow tubes filled with dead air space, and dead air was one of nature's finest insulators, the same principle that made down feathers and fiberglass insulation effective. The key was density and layering, creating multiple air pockets that would trap the heat radiating from their bodies and from whatever fire he could build inside the shelter. The first armload of cattails went into the culvert pipe, and Marcus began laying them in a thick mat across the concrete floor, stems crossing perpendicular to each other in a weaving pattern that created structural integrity while maximizing air pockets. He'd learned this technique from a Lakota elder named Joseph Red Cloud during survival training in South Dakota, an old man who'd grown up without electricity or running water and who taught him that indigenous knowledge wasn't primitive. It was tested across centuries and refined through the crucible of survival in environments that showed no mercy to ignorance. Daniel watched through half-closed eyes, his shivering now continuous and violent, his body's last-ditch effort to generate warmth through muscle contractions before it gave up entirely and surrendered to the cold. Marcus talked while he worked, his voice steady and calm, explaining each step not just for Daniel's benefit, but for anyone who might one day need this knowledge. His words a lifeline that kept the boy conscious and engaged. The ground layer of cattails went down 8 inches thick, significantly more than most people would think necessary, because the earth itself was frozen solid and would suck heat out of their bodies through conduction if they lay directly on it. He'd seen too many people survive cold nights only to develop deep tissue damage from ground-cold pressure sores that went to the bone because they hadn't understood that insulation worked in all directions, not just overhead. The sleeping bag principle applied here. You needed insulation below you just as much as above you, maybe more, because compressed insulation under body weight lost much of its effectiveness. Marcus made 4 more trips to the cattail stand, his own fingers starting to go numb despite his gloves, his breath coming in white clouds that dissipated instantly in the frigid air. Each armload got woven into the walls of the culvert, creating a thick thermal shell that would trap air and reflect heat back toward the center of the shelter. He worked in a spiral pattern, starting at the opening and moving inward, layering the cattails in a shingle-style arrangement where each new layer overlapped the one below by at least half, exactly like roofing shingles, to prevent cold air from finding channels through the insulation. The physical work generated heat, and Marcus felt his own core temperature stabilize as his muscles burned calories and produced warmth. But Daniel was beyond that now, too cold to shiver, sitting motionless under the mylar blanket, with the glassy-eyed stare that meant his body was shutting down non-essential functions to keep his brain and heart alive. They were running out of time. With the shelter walls insulated to a thickness of 6 inches, Marcus turned his attention to fire, knowing that without heat source, this entire construction was just an elaborate coffin. The ferro rod in his pack was reliable in any weather, requiring only dry tinder and proper technique, but finding dry tinder in a landscape where everything had been soaked by 3 weeks of freezing rain was the difference between warmth and death. He moved through the debris field around the highway, looking for anything that had been protected from moisture, and found it in an overturned semi-truck 50 yards away, a load of cardboard boxes that had stayed dry under the trailer, and inside them thousands of plastic bubble-wrap sheets that would burn hot and fast. Marcus gathered bubble wrap and cardboard, his mind already moving to the next problem, which was sustainable fuel once the initial fire was established. The cattail stalks themselves would burn, but they burned fast and produced more smoke than heat. What he needed was dense fuel that would burn slow and steady, and he found it in the creosote-soaked railroad ties that lined a section of track running parallel to the highway. Creosote was toxic when burned in enclosed spaces, but they'd have the culvert opening for ventilation, and the chemical-treated wood would burn even in damp conditions, producing the sustained heat they desperately needed. He arranged the tinder bundle inside the culvert at the back wall where the smoke would funnel out through the opening, and struck the ferro rod against the spine of his knife, sending a shower of white-hot sparks into the bubble wrap. It caught instantly, flames leaping up with a chemical stink, and he fed it cardboard until the fire had enough heat to accept the first chunks of railroad tie. The wood resisted at first, smoking heavily, but then caught with a greasy orange flame that produced immediate, radiating warmth. Marcus half-carried, half-dragged Daniel into the shelter, laying him on the thick cattail mat near the fire, but not so close that he'd burn, and immediately began the active rewarming process that every cold-weather medic learned in training. Passive rewarming, just letting the body warm up on its own, was dangerous in moderate to severe hypothermia because it could cause afterdrop, where cold blood from the extremities rushed back to the core and actually lowered core temperature further, potentially triggering cardiac arrest. Active external rewarming, applying heat to the body's core, was the safer approach for field conditions. He removed Daniel's wet socks and boots, knowing that wet clothing was a heat sink that would continue to pull warmth from the body even in a heated space, and replaced them with the spare pair of wool socks from his pack. Wool was magical because it retained insulating properties even when damp, the crimped structure of the fibers creating air pockets that held heat regardless of moisture content. The kid's jacket came off next, replaced with Marcus's own fleece layer, and then the mylar blanket wrapped around his torso, creating a heat-reflecting barrier that would trap the warmth radiating from the fire. The shelter's temperature climbed from 18 degrees to 30 degrees within 10 minutes, the cattail insulation proving its worth by preventing heat from escaping through the concrete walls. The culvert's dome shape helped, creating a natural convection current where hot air rose and circulated before cooling and sinking, the thermal mass of the railroad tie fire creating a steady warmth that filled the space. Marcus had positioned the fire carefully, accounting for wind direction and smoke ventilation, placing it far enough from the walls that the cattails wouldn't ignite, but close enough that radiant heat would warm the entire shelter. Daniel's color began to return, the terrifying blue tint of his lips fading to pale pink, his shivering resuming as his core temperature climbed back above the danger threshold. Shivering was good. It meant the body believed it could warm itself again, that the survival situation was no longer immediately life-threatening. The boy's eyes focused, awareness returning as his brain received adequate oxygen again, and he looked around the transformed culvert with something approaching wonder. Marcus sat back against the insulated wall and allowed himself a moment to breathe, to feel the warmth soaking into his own cold, stiffened muscles, to acknowledge the small victory that was one more life saved in a world that killed people by the thousands every day. But he couldn't rest long because shelter and warmth solved only the immediate crisis. They still needed water, food, and a plan for tomorrow. The canteen in his pack held maybe 2 cups of water, enough for one person for a few hours, not nearly enough for 2 people for an overnight stay. Dehydration killed almost as reliably as hypothermia, especially in cold weather where people didn't feel thirsty, even as their bodies lost moisture with every breath, every vapor cloud that puffed from their mouths, representing water molecules they couldn't afford to lose. But in a post-EMP world, every water source was potentially contaminated with runoff from failed sewage systems, chemical spills from unmonitored industrial sites, and the bodies of those who hadn't survived the first chaotic weeks. Marcus looked out through the culvert opening at the landscape around them, his eyes scanning for water sources that could be purified, and noticed a highway overpass a quarter-mile west with snow accumulated in the shadows underneath. Snow was just frozen water, and while it wasn't efficient, you needed to melt significant volume to get drinkable amounts. It was safer than surface water when properly processed. More importantly, the overpass structure meant shelter from ashfall, which meant the snow wouldn't be contaminated with the radioactive particles that made most precipitation in the region dangerous to consume. He explained his plan to Daniel, who was now alert enough to understand, and together they made the journey to the overpass, moving slowly to avoid aggravating the boy's injured ankle. The snow lay in wind-drifted banks against the concrete support pillars, crystalline and relatively clean, and Marcus filled his canteen and Daniel's empty water bottle with packed snow before heading back to the warmth of the culvert. The water purification method he chose was one he'd taught dozens of times in survivor camps across Washington and Idaho, a technique that required nothing more than a metal container, fire, and patience. Boiling was the gold standard for killing pathogens. Bacteria, viruses, and parasites all died at temperatures well below the boiling point of water, and maintaining a rolling boil for 1 minute at their elevation guaranteed safe drinking water even from the most questionable sources. The railroad tie fire burned hot enough to bring the canteen to a boil in minutes, and Marcus held it over the flames with a piece of cattail stalk wrapped around the handle as an improvised heat shield. While the water boiled, he addressed Daniel's ankle, which had swollen to the point where the skin was tight and discolored, clearly a dislocation that needed to be reduced before permanent damage occurred to the surrounding ligaments and tendons. Marcus had performed this procedure in combat conditions, in field hospitals, in the backs of moving vehicles, and each time the principle was the same: align the joint, apply controlled force, and reduce the dislocation with one smooth motion that caused intense but brief pain, followed by immediate relief. He talked Daniel through what was about to happen, explaining each step in advance, because informed patients handled procedures better than those taken by surprise, their fear response lower, their trust higher, their pain tolerance slightly elevated by the sense of control that understanding provided. The boy nodded, jaw clenched, hands gripping the mylar blanket, and Marcus positioned himself at the proper angle, one hand stabilizing the lower leg, the other gripping the foot, applying steady traction while simultaneously rotating the ankle through the motion that would pop the joint back into alignment. The sound was audible, a click-thunk that every medic recognized, and Daniel gasped with pain that transformed immediately into relief as the pressure released and normal joint function restored. Marcus didn't stop there. Reduction was only the first step. He splinted the ankle using 2 straight pieces of wood scavenged from shattered pallets near the highway, binding them with paracord in a figure-8 pattern that immobilized the joint while allowing circulation to continue to the foot. The splint would need to stay on for at least 2 weeks, longer if possible, giving the supporting structures time to heal and stabilize. The boiled water cooled slowly in the canteen, and Marcus poured half of it into Daniel's bottle before taking a measured drink from his own container, the warm liquid hitting his stomach like a blessing, rehydrating tissues that had been operating in deficit for too long. They sat in the cattail-insulated shelter, watching the fire burn down to coals, and for the first time in hours, the immediate threat of death receded enough for conversation. Daniel told his story in fragments, his voice still weak, but gaining strength with each word. His parents, teachers in Billings, Montana, had been in Seattle visiting colleges when the pulse hit. Their car dead on I-90 just outside the city when every electrical system in North America shut down simultaneously. They'd walked for 3 days before his father started showing symptoms of radiation sickness, nausea, hair loss, bleeding gums, clear signs of exposure from the Hanford nuclear facility's meltdown upwind. His mother had followed 2 days later, and they'd both made the impossible decision to send Daniel ahead while they still had the strength to give him supplies, knowing that slowing down for them would mean death for all 3 rather than possible survival for one. Marcus listened without judgment, without empty comfort, because he understood that in the post-pulse world, impossible choices were the only kind that existed, and judging those choices from a position of survival was the worst kind of arrogance. Daniel had been walking east for 6 days, following the highway because it was the only landmark that made sense, aiming for the supposed safe zone in Montana that might not exist, might be just another rumor in a landscape where hope and misinformation were impossible to distinguish. The fire crackled, sending up small showers of sparks, and Marcus found himself talking about Emma, his 8-year-old daughter, who loved dinosaurs and who'd been at Viewpoint Elementary in Seattle when the pulse turned the city into chaos. He'd reached the school on day 3, navigating through riots and fires and desperate crowds, only to find it empty, evacuated, with a handwritten note taped to the door saying, "Children relocated to Everett staging area." Boom! But Everett had been overrun by refugees from the coast, and the staging area was a burned-out parking lot with no records, no information, just more people asking the same desperate questions about their missing loved ones. He'd tracked rumors through survivor networks, trading medical care for information, moving from camp to camp with the systematic approach of someone who refused to accept absence of evidence as evidence of absence. Someone in Wenatchee said they'd seen a school group heading toward Spokane. Someone in Spokane said the groups had been consolidated and sent to Montana. Someone in Montana said nothing because he hadn't made it that far yet, hadn't found the end of the trail that kept stretching forward like a cruel promise that maybe, if he just walked far enough, searched hard enough, refused to give up, he'd find her alive and safe and waiting. Daniel listened, and in the warm glow of the fire, surrounded by cattail walls that held back the killing cold, Two survivors who'd lost everything except the will to keep moving shared the burden of hope that was too heavy to carry alone. Marcus didn't promise that they'd find Emma or reach Montana, or that the safe zone was real. He promised only what he could control. That tomorrow they'd walk together, that Daniel wouldn't face the wasteland alone, that knowledge and skill and stubborn refusal to quit would give them better odds than ignorance and isolation. As the temperature outside dropped below 10 degrees and the ash-darkened sky surrendered to full night, Marcus added another railroad tie to the fire, adjusting their position to maximize heat retention while minimizing smoke exposure, and began teaching Daniel the principles of long-term survival that extended beyond immediate shelter construction. Food was the next critical resource, and in a nuclear winter landscape where farming had failed and wildlife was scarce, knowing which plants remained edible, how to preserve meat when you found it, and how to stretch calories across lean days was knowledge that separated long-term survivors from those who simply lasted a bit longer before starvation claimed them. The cattails themselves were a food source that most people walked past without recognition. The roots were edible year-round, starchy and nutritious, and could be processed into flour that would keep for months if stored properly. Marcus explained how to identify the rhizomes underground, how to clean and prepare them, how to extract the starch through a simple process of crushing, washing and settling that required nothing more than water and time. He talked about dandelions, about wild onions, about the bark of certain trees that could be scraped and dried and ground into a supplemental flour that added fiber and nutrients to a diet that would otherwise be dangerously lacking in vegetables. He talked about protein preservation, how to smoke meat using green wood that produced steady, cool smoke that would preserve flesh for weeks without refrigeration. How to salt cure using road salt or ocean salt, drawing moisture out of meat through osmosis and creating an environment hostile to the bacteria that caused spoilage. How to render fat into long-lasting calories that the body desperately needed in cold weather, the energy density of fat being 9 calories per gram compared to 4 calories per gram for protein or carbohydrates, a difference that meant survival or slow starvation when food was scarce. Daniel asked questions, his mind sharp despite the trauma of the past week, and Marcus recognized the intelligence that would make this kid valuable in any survivor community, the ability to learn quickly, to retain information, to understand principles rather than just memorizing steps. Teaching was investment in the future, every person who learned survival skills becoming a multiplier who could teach others, creating networks of knowledge that could preserve civilization's hard-won understanding of how to live in harmony with harsh environments. The night deepened, the fire burned lower, and eventually exhaustion claimed them both, their bodies demanding rest after the day's exertions. Marcus set his internal alarm for 2-hour intervals, a habit from military training where perimeter security required constant vigilance, and each time he woke, he added wood to the fire, checked Daniel's breathing and color, and scanned the darkness outside the culvert for threats that might be human or animal, or simply the cold, looking for any weakness in their defenses. Morning came gray and ash-laden, the sun, a dim suggestion behind clouds that seemed permanently fixed in the sky, and Marcus woke fully to the sounds of Daniel moving stiffly on the cattail mat, testing his splintered ankle with the careful attention of someone learning his new limitations. The shelter had held the warmth through the night, the temperature inside hovering around 45 degrees, despite the sub-freezing conditions outside. Proof that proper insulation could create livable space even in hostile environments. They shared the remaining boiled water and a breakfast of emergency ration bars from Marcus's pack, each bar containing 600 calories of dense nutrition that tasted like cardboard and honey, but would fuel their bodies for the day's walk ahead. Marcus checked Daniel's ankle, satisfied that the swelling was beginning to decrease and that the splint remained properly positioned, then began the process of dismantling the shelter in reverse order, packing cattails back into his pack for future use, because knowledge combined with raw materials was portable security. Before they left, he taught Daniel one more critical skill: how to create a water filter using materials they could find anywhere. He took an empty plastic bottle from the debris near the highway, cut the bottom off, and inverted it to create a funnel-shaped container. The layering was specific and important: coarse gravel at the top to filter large particles, then sand to catch finer sediment, then crushed charcoal from the previous night's fire to filter chemicals and improve taste, then another layer of sand, then a coffee filter he'd been carrying for this exact purpose at the bottom to catch any remaining particles. Water poured through this filter would emerge clearer and safer, not perfectly pure, but significantly better than untreated surface water. And when combined with boiling or chemical treatment, it provided potable water from sources that would otherwise cause dysentery, cholera, or a dozen other waterborne diseases that killed people who survived everything else, only to die from contaminated water. Daniel assembled his own filter under Marcus's guidance, learning the principles behind each layer, understanding why order mattered and how different materials captured different contaminants. This was education in its purest form, knowledge transferred through demonstration and practice, the kind of learning that stuck because it was connected to immediate survival need rather than abstract future application. They packed their meager supplies, extinguished the fire completely using snow to ensure no embers remained to start a wildfire, and stepped out of the culvert into a morning that was 10 degrees and silent. The ash fall heavier now, coating everything in a fine grey powder that made the landscape look like an alien world. The highway stretched east toward Montana, a ribbon of cracked asphalt lined with abandoned cars and semi-trucks, and they began walking, Daniel using a crutch Marcus fashioned from a tree branch, their pace slow but steady, covering maybe 2 miles per hour instead of the 3 or 4 a healthy person could maintain. The landscape they moved through was a graveyard of the old world. Each abandoned vehicle a story of someone who'd been driving when the pulse hit, who'd stepped out of their dead car expecting help that never came, who'd made decisions about whether to wait or walk, whether to stay together or split up, whether to trust strangers or avoid them. Some vehicles showed signs of habitation: blankets in back seats, empty food containers, messages written on windows for missing family members. Others had been stripped of anything useful, doors hanging open, interiors gutted by scavengers who'd come through in those first desperate weeks. They found bodies occasionally, frozen solid now, preserved by the cold. And Marcus didn't shield Daniel from these sights, because in the post-pulse world, death was a teacher that demanded attention. Each body told a story, if you knew how to read it. This person died from exposure, huddled against a tire for windbreak, but without proper insulation. This person died from injury, infection probably, judging from the swollen leg and feverish attempt to reach medical help that wasn't there. This person died from violence, and Marcus didn't linger on those scenes because there was nothing to learn except that humanity's worst impulses didn't disappear just because civilization did. By midday, they'd covered 6 miles, and Daniel's ankle was holding up better than Marcus had hoped, the splint distributing weight properly and preventing re-injury. They stopped for rest in the shell of a gas station, its windows shattered and its shelves long since looted, but the structure still provided windbreak and a chance to elevate Daniel's leg and reduce the pressure building in his injured joint. Marcus used the brake to scout the area, and his trained eye spotted something valuable: a propane tank behind the gas station, the large kind that fed commercial buildings, and beside it a collection of camping propane canisters that had been overlooked in the initial looting frenzy. Propane was gold in the post-pulse world, a portable fuel source that burned clean and hot, that could boil water and cook food, and provide warmth without the smoke and maintenance requirements of wood fires. He checked each canister by weight, finding 3 that were still more than half full, and added them to his pack, despite the extra weight, because fuel was survival. The discovery sparked an idea, and Marcus began teaching Daniel about resource recognition in urban environments, training his eyes to see value in places most people ignored. The gas station's bathroom, though disgusting and frozen, contained a toilet tank that held several gallons of relatively clean water, not drinking quality without treatment, but usable for washing or for initial rinse before purification. The dropped ceiling tiles concealed insulation that could be repurposed for shelter building. The metal shelving could be disassembled into tools or weapons or framework for structures. The rubber gaskets around the freezer doors were waterproof material that could patch holes or create seal in shelter construction. Daniel absorbed the lessons with the focused attention of someone who understood that everything Marcus taught might mean the difference between survival and death somewhere down the line. They spent an hour stripping useful materials from the gas station, creating caches of resources that other travelers might find, leaving handwritten notes about water purification and shelter construction, because in a world without internet or books or expert help, knowledge sharing became an act of community service that could save lives of people they'd never meet. When they resumed walking, the temperature had climbed to a balmy 15 degrees, and Marcus found himself thinking about seasonal patterns in the new nuclear winter climate. The ash cloud would persist for years, maybe decades, blocking sunlight and suppressing temperatures, creating a permanent winter that would fundamentally alter survival strategies. Traditional farming was impossible without sunlight for photosynthesis, which meant survivors needed to either find greenhouse materials to grow food under artificial protection or adapt to a hunter-gatherer existence that followed remaining wildlife populations or established themselves near geothermal features where microclimates might support limited agriculture. The Montana Safe Zone, if it existed, likely occupied one of those geothermal areas. Yellowstone region probably, where hot springs and thermal vents created pockets of warmth and where underground heat could support greenhouse operations. But Yellowstone was also a supervolcano, dormant but not extinct, and Marcus couldn't shake the irony that survivors might be clustering around a geological feature that could erupt and kill them all more efficiently than the pulse had. They walked through the afternoon, the landscape unchanging. Dead trees, grey snow, abandoned vehicles, silence broken only by wind and their own footsteps. Daniel talked more as the day progressed, his strength returning, and Marcus learned that the boy had been studying environmental science before the pulse, planning to become a park ranger, dreams that now seemed like artifacts from a different civilization. But the knowledge remained relevant, maybe more relevant than before, and Marcus encouraged Daniel to remember everything he'd learned about ecosystems, about plant identification, about wildlife behavior, because specialists with expertise were valuable members of any survivor community. As evening approached and the temperature began its inevitable drop toward another killing night, Marcus spotted what he'd been hoping for. A small town, or what remained of it, clustered around an exit ramp a mile ahead. Towns meant resources, but they also meant potential danger from other survivors, from unstable structures, from disease concentrated wherever bodies had piled up. They approached carefully, Marcus moving ahead to scout, while Daniel waited at a distance, establishing hand signals for danger or all clear, because communication without radios required visual contact and prearranged meanings. The town had been hit hard in the initial chaos. Fire damage on several buildings, evidence of violent looting, barricades that had failed to protect whatever they'd been defending. But Marcus's focus was on shelter options, and he found it in a single-story brick building that had been a library, its walls intact, its doors forced open, but its structure sound. Libraries were good survival locations because they had multiple exit routes, because brick construction provided thermal mass that moderated temperature swings, because they'd been designed for public use with bathrooms and sometimes kitchens. He cleared the building room by room, checking for bodies or survivors or dangers, and found it empty except for scattered books and overturned furniture. The heating system was dead, of course, but the building's interior was noticeably warmer than outside, probably 30 degrees, the brick walls holding onto heat from the previous summer and releasing it slowly into the winter air, a phenomenon that would continue for months until the building fully equilibrated with the outside temperature. Marcus signaled Daniel to approach, and together they established shelter in the library's back room, which had been a break room for staff and still contained a sink, cabinets, and most importantly, a large south-facing window that could capture any available sunlight. They blocked the door with furniture to create a defensible space, covered the window with layers of plastic bags to provide insulation while allowing light, and used books as insulation material, stacking them along walls to create air pockets that trapped heat. The propane canisters came into use, connected to a small camping stove Marcus had been carrying, and for the first time in days they had hot food. Canned soup from Marcus's supplies, heated to steaming and shared between them, the warmth spreading through their bodies like medicine. Daniel's color was good, his speech clear, his ankle responding well to the rest and elevation, and Marcus allowed himself to believe they'd both survive another night. After dinner, by the light of a single candle, Marcus taught Daniel about psychological survival, the techniques that kept people mentally intact when physical survival consumed all their energy. Routine was critical, establishing patterns of waking, eating, working, resting that gave structure to days that otherwise blurred together in grey sameness. Purpose was equally important, having a goal beyond immediate survival, something to work toward, whether it was reaching a destination or learning a skill or helping another person. Community mattered most of all. The human need for connection so powerful that isolation could kill as surely as cold or hunger, the mind turning inward and dark without external stimulation and shared experience. Daniel confessed that he'd been struggling with despair, with the temptation to simply stop walking and let the cold take him, to surrender to the overwhelming weight of loss and impossibility. Marcus understood, because he'd felt it too. Those dark moments when continuing seemed pointless, and the past seemed like a dream that hurt too much to remember. He shared his own coping mechanisms, talking to Emma in his head, narrating his day as if she were listening, keeping her alive through memory and imagination, even when he didn't know if she was physically alive. He told Daniel about the other people he'd saved, how each one became a reason to continue, how purpose could be constructed from helping others even when you couldn't help yourself. The conversation drifted to philosophy, to questions about what they were surviving for, what kind of world they wanted to build from the ashes of the old one. Daniel wondered if humanity deserved a second chance after all the environmental destruction and war and inequality that had characterized the pre-Pulse civilization. Marcus acknowledged the darkness, but argued for hope, pointing out that every disaster in human history had been followed by rebuilding, that resilience was humanity's defining trait, that the worst of times brought out both the worst and best in people, and choosing which to emulate was the fundamental moral decision every survivor faced daily. They slept in shifts again, Marcus maintaining watch through the coldest hours, and the library held its warmth adequately, the book-insulated walls proving their worth. Morning brought a surprise, fresh snowfall, clean and white, covering the ash that had coated everything, transforming the dead landscape into something almost beautiful. The temperature had risen to 20 degrees, a heat wave by recent standards, and Marcus recognized opportunity. Clean snow meant abundant water without ash contamination. Fresh snowfall meant they could see tracks of any wildlife or humans moving through the area. Higher temperatures meant easier travel and reduced cold injury risk. They needed to take advantage of favorable conditions while they lasted, because in the post-Pulse world, good days were gifts that might not come again for weeks. Marcus proposed a resource-gathering mission, teaching Daniel how to salvage systematically rather than randomly looting. They moved through the town with purpose, checking houses methodically, looking for specific items, medications, particularly antibiotics and pain relievers, warm clothing, especially wool and synthetic materials that held insulation when wet, non-perishable food, prioritizing calorie-dense items like peanut butter, cooking oil, and canned meat. Tools, especially knives, axes, and fire-starting equipment. Information, any maps or survival guides or medical references that had been printed. Before the Pulse, in a house that had been a doctor's residence, they found a medical bag containing sutures, antibiotics, morphine ampules, and a basic surgical kit. A treasure beyond measure in a world where infection was a death sentence and pain management was the difference between functional and incapacitated. Marcus carefully inventoried each item, explaining its use to Daniel, teaching him basic wound care and medication dosing because the boy might need to treat injuries when Marcus wasn't there, might need to save his own life or someone else's, using knowledge acquired now in these quiet teaching moments. They found wool blankets, waterproof jackets, a hand-cranked radio that might still pick up transmissions if any stations were broadcasting, candles, matches, a manual can opener, and most unexpectedly, a printed survival guide someone had been studying, its pages marked with highlighted passages and handwritten notes. Marcus sat in the cold living room and read through it, comparing techniques to his own knowledge, finding both confirmation of methods he'd been teaching and new approaches he hadn't considered. The guide included instructions for making charcoal water filters, for preserving eggs in lime solution, for building solar stills that could extract water from contaminated sources through evaporation and condensation, for treating frostbite with gradual rewarming rather than rapid heating that could cause tissue damage. Each technique was another tool in the survival toolkit, another option when circumstances demanded adaptation, another piece of knowledge that could be shared with other survivors. By afternoon, they'd accumulated more supplies than they could carry, and Marcus made the strategic decision to establish a cache, hiding excess materials in a weatherproof location marked with subtle signs that other survivors might recognize while raiders or opportunists would pass by. He used a code system he'd developed, small rock cairns in specific patterns that indicated medical supplies or food or dangerous area to those who'd learned the language, but meant nothing to those who hadn't. The concept of mutual aid networks was spreading among survivor communities, people recognizing that long-term survival required cooperation rather than competition, that hoarding resources ultimately harmed everyone when supply chains were permanently broken and manufacturing was impossible without electricity and global trade networks. Marcus had contributed to several caches across Washington and Idaho, taking what he needed, leaving what others might need, trusting that the same philosophy would mean help was available when he needed it. They spent a second night in the library, warmer and better supplied than the previous night, and Marcus used the evening to teach Daniel about navigation without GPS or functional compasses, the latter being unreliable in areas with electromagnetic interference or iron-rich geology. The sun, when visible through the ash clouds, still rose in the east and set in the west, providing directional reference. The North Star, Polaris, was still visible on clear nights, marking true north for travelers in the northern hemisphere. Moss growing on tree trunks tended to favor the north side in the northern hemisphere, where less direct sunlight reached. Rivers generally flowed toward larger bodies of water, following gravity and topography. But navigation was more than just finding north. It required understanding terrain, recognizing landmarks, estimating distances, and maintaining awareness of position relative to known features. Marcus taught Daniel to count paces, to estimate distances by time walked, to recognize terrain types and their implications for travel, to read signs of human habitation and activity. These skills had kept him alive through hundreds of miles of post-pulse wilderness, and they'd do the same for Daniel if they got separated, or if Marcus didn't make it and the boy had to continue alone. The third morning brought temperatures dropping back towards single digits, a reminder that the warm period had been anomaly rather than trend, and they left the library with heavy packs and renewed determination, heading east toward Montana, toward the rumored safe zone, toward whatever future existed beyond the next frozen mile. Daniel walked steadier now, his ankle healing, his body adapting to the constant physical demands of post-apocalyptic travel, and Marcus felt something like pride watching the kid transform from victim to survivor. The highway continued its monotonous path through dead forests and abandoned infrastructure, but now Marcus pointed out details Daniel had been missing. The difference between hardwood and softwood trees, important for selecting firewood and construction materials, the signs of animal activity, rare but not extinct, indicating pockets of surviving wildlife. The evidence of other travelers, recent footprints or disturbed snow or caches they'd left, confirming they weren't the only ones moving. East, they encountered other survivors on the fourth day. A group of 6 camped in an overpass shelter, and Marcus approached with visible hands and non-threatening posture, the protocol that had been developing organically among survivor communities. The group was mixed, 2 women, 3 men, 1 child, all showing signs of malnutrition and cold exposure, but still functional, still moving. They shared information cautiously, confirming that the Montana safe zone was real, that it was Bozeman specifically, that the community there had greenhouses and geothermal power and medical care, but also warning that resources were stretched and newcomers weren't guaranteed entry. Marcus traded medical supplies for food, antibiotics for 2 cans of beef stew and a bag of dried beans, the exchange rate in the post-pulse economy being brutally practical and constantly shifting based on immediate need. He treated a woman's infected finger without charge, cleaning the wound and applying antibiotic ointment and fresh bandaging, because some things shouldn't have a price, and because building trust between survivor groups was investment in future mutual aid. The group's leader, a former paramedic named Sarah, who was 40 and competent, invited them to travel together, safety in numbers being a legitimate concern when raiders and desperate individuals were known to target lone travelers. Marcus agreed, and the group of 8 continued east together, their combined skills creating efficiency that benefited everyone. Sarah knew advanced medical care. One of the men named Victor knew electrical systems and small engine repair. One of the women named Aisha knew agriculture and seed preservation, and their child, a 9-year-old girl named Zara, knew how to stay quiet and observe, skills that made her an effective scout for approaching danger. Traveling with a group changed the dynamic, transforming solitary survival into communal effort, and Marcus found himself teaching not just Daniel, but all of them, sharing knowledge while learning from their expertise. Victor taught him about mechanical advantage principles for moving heavy objects, about using leverage and pulleys and inclined planes to accomplish tasks that seemed impossible with human strength alone. Aisha taught him about seed viability testing, about germination techniques, about companion planting that maximized yield while minimizing pest damage and soil depletion. Sarah's medical knowledge complemented his own, her paramedicine training filling gaps in his combat medic background, and together they treated injuries and illnesses in the group with a competence that kept everyone functional. The collaboration felt like civilization's kernel, like the beginning of something that could grow into community and eventually into society, if enough people survived and cooperated and refused to descend into the brutality that consumed some survivor groups. They covered better distance as a group, 15 miles some days, their combined resources meaning better shelter and more adequate food and improved security. Marcus taught them his shelter construction techniques, and they taught him speed techniques they'd developed, and the synthesis created methods superior to what any of them had known individually. They established a routine of rotating watch, communal food preparation, shared storytelling that maintained morale and psychological health, and daily skill-sharing sessions that expanded everyone's knowledge base. The landscape began changing as they pushed into Montana, the flat plains giving way to foothills, the ashfall less heavy, the temperatures paradoxically colder because elevation meant thinner air and less retained heat. But they also started seeing signs of organization, trail markers that weren't pre-pulse highway signs, supply caches with recent dates, messages carved into trees directing travelers towards safe routes and warning away from dangerous areas. On the 7th day of traveling together, they encountered a patrol from the Bozeman Safe Zone, 3 armed individuals on horseback conducting the kind of perimeter security that indicated legitimate organization and resources. The patrol leader, a woman named Commander Chen, no relation to Marcus, questioned them carefully about where they'd come from, what skills they had, whether they'd seen raiders or hostile groups, whether they were carrying disease or infection. Marcus explained their journey, vouched for his group, offered his medical and survival expertise, and demonstrated competence by accurately treating a patrol member's minor injury on the spot. Commander Chen's demeanor shifted from suspicious to welcoming, and she explained that Bozeman had space for people who contributed, who shared resources, who brought skills rather than just need, and that their group qualified based on what she'd seen. The final approach to Bozeman took 2 days, following a patrol escort that ensured they didn't stumble into defensive perimeters or trigger security responses. And Marcus felt something he hadn't felt since the Pulse, anticipation that wasn't entirely anxiety. The safe zone appeared as a cluster of greenhouses glowing with internal light, surrounded by defensive walls built from cars and shipping containers, populated by hundreds of survivors moving with purpose rather than desperation, smoke rising from controlled fires rather than uncontrolled burns. They passed through security checkpoints, submitted to medical screening that confirmed they weren't carrying communicable disease, provided information about their backgrounds and skills, and were assigned temporary housing in a converted warehouse that had been sectioned into family units with wood stove heating and communal bathrooms that actually worked, fed by geothermal hot water that felt like impossible luxury. Marcus spent his first evening in Bozeman walking through the community, observing how survivors had organized themselves, noting the greenhouse operations where food actually grew under artificial LED lights powered by geothermal electricity, seeing the medical clinic where Sarah would be working, watching children play in a designated safe area while adults stood watch against threats that were external rather than internal. The community wasn't perfect. Resources were carefully rationed, decisions were made by council rather than democracy, security was tight and suspicious, but it was functional, it was growing, it was proving that civilization could rebuild from nothing if people cooperated and contributed and refused to give up. He found Daniel that evening. The boy settled into a youth dormitory with other teenagers, his ankle being properly examined by an actual doctor with actual medical equipment, and they sat together in the communal dining area, sharing a meal of greenhouse vegetables and preserved meat that tasted like victory. Daniel asked if Marcus would stay, if he'd found what he was looking for, and Marcus admitted he hadn't, because Emma wasn't here, because the search continued, because he couldn't stop until he knew for certain one way or another. But he also acknowledged that Bozeman was a place worth staying, worth contributing to, worth defending, and that even if Emma wasn't here now, information networks existed, and messages traveled, and maybe, probably, hopefully, someone in one of the other safe zones scattered across the Northwest had information about school evacuations, about children relocated, about an 8-year-old girl who loved dinosaurs and who might be waiting for someone to find her. Commander Chen approached him after dinner, offering him a position training new arrivals in survival skills, teaching the techniques that could keep people alive during the resource-gathering missions that extended beyond the safe zone. And Marcus accepted because teaching was purpose, and purpose was what kept people sane in a world that had gone insane. He'd teach them cattail shelter construction, water purification, navigation, medical basics, all the knowledge he'd accumulated through training and experience and the terrible education that came from living in the post-Pulse wasteland. Daniel would stay. That much was clear, the community having space for young people and recognizing that investing in the next generation was investing in humanity's future. The boy had skills now, had knowledge, had confidence that came from surviving impossible situations and learning that competence was the antidote to helplessness. He'd grow up in Bozeman, contribute to the community, maybe eventually join the patrols or work in the greenhouses or become a teacher himself, passing on what Marcus had taught him to the next wave of survivors who'd need to know how to live in the world the Pulse had created. Marcus spent 2 weeks in Bozeman, teaching daily classes, treating medical cases, contributing to the community's knowledge base, and building relationships with people who were trying to preserve humanity's best impulses rather than surrendering to its worst. He learned about other safe zones. Missoula had a smaller community. Helena had organized around a geothermal power plant. There were rumors of a larger settlement in Wyoming, and he added their locations to his mental map of places to search for Emma. The night before he left, the community held a gathering, a practice they'd developed to mark arrivals and departures and to maintain social cohesion through shared experience. People told stories, shared songs from memory, passed around precious photographs of the world before, and Marcus talked about Emma, about his search, about the hope that kept him moving when logic said stopping would be easier. An older man approached him after, a teacher named Mr. Abernathy, who'd been at an elementary school in Everett when the Pulse hit, who'd helped evacuate children, and who remembered groups being sent to different locations depending on which parents could be contacted and which couldn't. He didn't have specific information about Emma, but he had a list, handwritten, carefully preserved, of names and destinations, and he gave it to Marcus like a treasure map to a future that might still exist. Emma's name wasn't on the list, but neither was the notation deceased or lost or unclaimed, which meant she'd been in a group that had been matched with family or sent to a consolidation point. And Mr. Abernathy couldn't be sure, but thought that some groups had gone to Missoula, to a safe zone that had announced capacity for children specifically. Marcus left Bozeman the next morning with new supplies, better equipment, the handwritten list, and a destination that was specific rather than vague. Daniel walked him to the security checkpoint, and they embraced with the unself-conscious affection of people who'd saved each other's lives, who'd shared impossible experiences, who'd become family through circumstance and choice. The boy was crying, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming emotion of gratitude and loss and hope all tangled together, and Marcus told him what he needed to hear, that survival was achievement, that knowledge was power, that every person he'd helped was Emma by proxy because he couldn't help her directly, and that continuing was honor even when stopping seemed reasonable. The journey to Missoula took 8 days, the route now familiar, the survival techniques automatic, the loneliness returning but manageable because purpose drove him forward. He passed through the same gas station where he'd found the propane, left supplies in the cache he'd created, maintained the mutual aid network that connected scattered survivors across hundreds of miles. He encountered patrols from Bozeman, ranging outward, establishing supply lines and communication networks, and he shared information about routes and resources and dangers, contributing to the collective knowledge that made survival marginally less impossible. Missoula's safe zone was smaller than Bozeman, focused around a university campus that had dormitories and laboratories and infrastructure, and Marcus presented himself to their security with the same patient competence he'd shown in Bozeman. The intake process was more relaxed here, the community desperate for people with skills, and they fast-tracked him through processing when they learned he was a medic and survival instructor. He asked about children immediately, about evacuations from Seattle elementary schools, and was directed to a woman named Ms. Patricia, who coordinated the youth program and who had records, actual written records, of every child in the community and their origin stories. She sat with him in a quiet office, her face kind but guarded because she'd delivered bad news too many times, and went through the list methodically while Marcus held his breath and prayed to whatever force might still be listening in a world that seemed abandoned by anything divine. Emma's name appeared halfway down the third page, the handwriting careful and clear. Emma Chen, age 8, Viewpoint Elementary, Seattle, evacuated to Everett Staging, transferred to Missoula Group 7, arrival day 23, currently housed in Youth Dormitory Building 4, Room 12. The words blurred as Marcus's eyes filled with tears he'd been holding back for 49 days, the precise count carved into his consciousness like a tally of survival, and Ms. Patricia was smiling through her own tears because she'd seen enough tragedy that witnessing reunion was a gift she gave herself permission to cherish. She stood, offered to take him to Building 4, and Marcus followed on legs that barely supported him, his entire body shaking with emotion that was too big to contain. Building 4 was a converted dormitory warmed by wood stoves, its walls decorated with children's artwork, its atmosphere somehow managing to be cheerful despite circumstances. And Room 12 was at the end of a hallway that seemed to stretch forever. Miss Patricia knocked gently, and a young woman answered, a teacher, it turned out, named Miss Amanda, who supervised a group of 8 children aged 7 to 10. And there, sitting cross-legged on a bed made from blankets and pillows, drawing in a notebook with a pencil worn down to a nub, was Emma. She looked up when the door opened, her face thin but healthy, her eyes bright with intelligence Marcus recognized from before the world ended, and for a frozen moment they stared at each other across a distance that was only 8 feet, but felt like 8 million miles of grief and searching and desperate hope. Then Emma's face transformed with recognition that was immediate and total, and she screamed, "Dad!" with a volume that brought every child in the room to attention, and launched herself across the space between them with the absolute trust that he would catch her, that he would be solid, that he was real and not another dream in a sleep filled with nightmares of separation. Marcus caught her and held on with arms that wouldn't let go, feeling her solid weight, her warm breath, her living heartbeat against his chest. And he wept with the ugly, gasping sobs of someone who'd been holding back an ocean of grief and finally let it flood out. Emma cried too, her small hands gripping his shirt, her voice saying, "I knew you'd find me. I knew you wouldn't stop looking. I told everyone you were coming." And Marcus realized that faith had worked in both directions, that she'd been holding on to hope just as desperately as he had. The reunion was witnessed by children who'd lost their own parents, who understood that this moment was both celebration and reminder of what they'd lost. And Miss Amanda quietly ushered them into another room to give Marcus and Emma privacy, while they held each other and cried and whispered affirmations that yes, this was real, yes, they'd survived, yes, they were together now. Eventually the tears subsided enough for words beyond "I found you" and "I knew you would," and Emma told her story in fragments punctuated by more crying and hugging. She'd been at school when the pulse hit, power going out, teachers confused, children scared. then organized evacuation because the teachers had been trained for emergencies, even if they'd never imagined this one. They'd walked to Everett, 3 days of travel with 40 children and 5 adults, sleeping in churches and community centers, eating donated food while it lasted. Everett had been chaos, refugees everywhere, but they'd stayed together as a school group and eventually been matched with a convoy heading to Montana, organized by someone who'd had communication with Missoula before the EMP fully cut off all long-range contact. The journey had been cold and scary, but they'd stayed together, and the adults had kept them safe, and Miss Amanda had been kind and made sure they had food and told stories at night and helped them believe their parents would find them if their parents were still alive. Emma had believed absolutely, with the unshakable faith of 8-year-olds who hadn't yet learned that adults sometimes fail to keep promises. And she'd been right, which meant Marcus's stubbornness and skill and refusal to give up had been justified by the only outcome that mattered. They sat together in room 12 while Emma showed him her drawings, dinosaurs, of course, but also drawings of the journey, of the people who'd helped her, of her imagined picture of what her dad was doing while searching for her. And Marcus looked at these artifacts of her resilience and felt pride that transcended the guilt of having taken 49 days to reach her. She'd survived. She'd adapted. She'd maintained hope. She was stronger than he'd imagined, and that strength had come from both her own character and from the community of survivors who'd cared for children who weren't biologically theirs because caring was what separated humans from the wasteland. The evening meal in Missoula's communal dining hall was celebration, miss. Patricia having spread word that her father had found his daughter, and the community responded with the collective joy of people who needed reminders that good things still happened. Strangers congratulated them, shared their own reunion stories, or expressed hope for their own missing loved ones, and the meal felt like Thanksgiving in its purest sense. Gratitude for survival, for connection, for the stubborn persistence of love in a world that had tried to kill it. Marcus committed to staying in Missoula, making it their home, contributing his skills to a community that had saved his daughter, and Emma was delighted by the decision, showing him around the youth dormitory, introducing him to her friends, explaining the routines and rules and social dynamics with the seriousness of someone giving a tour of a new civilization. She'd made a life here in 49 days, had adapted and found purpose and created relationships, and Marcus recognized that even if he'd found her on day 2, she'd needed this experience, this proof that she could survive without him, this confidence that came from resilience, tested and proven. The weeks that followed were rebuilding of a different kind, not rebuilding shelter or finding food, but rebuilding the relationship between father and daughter across a gap of trauma and separation. They talked every evening, Emma sharing her experiences, Marcus sharing his, both of them processing the impossibility they'd survived. He taught survival skills to Missoula's community during the day, and Emma attended the makeshift school Miss Amanda ran, learning not just pre-pulse subjects, but post-pulse necessities like water purification and basic first aid and plant identification. Marcus watched his daughter grow into the new world with a mixture of pride and heartbreak, seeing her lose childhood innocence while gaining competence that could keep her alive. She learned to build fires, to recognize edible plants, to treat minor injuries, to read weather patterns, all the knowledge that once would have been optional enrichment but was now essential curriculum. She was 8 years old and could construct a thermal shelter from cattails, could purify water 3 different ways, could splint a broken bone and treat mild hypothermia, skills that transformed her from victim to survivor. The community around them was growing, more survivors arriving, knowledge being shared, infrastructure being rebuilt, and Marcus saw the shape of humanity's future taking form in Missoula and Bozeman and the other safe zones scattered across the Northwest. It wasn't the world before. That world was gone. its infrastructure dead, its complexity unsustainable without electricity and global supply chains and the million invisible connections that had made modern life possible. But it was a world. It was human. It was proof that cooperation and knowledge and stubborn hope could create civilization from ruins. Standing in the morning light that penetrated the ash clouds, more each week as the nuclear winter slowly, infinitesimally, began to release its grip on the atmosphere, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt since the pulse. Peace. Not happiness, because too much had been lost, but peace that came from acceptance of what was, from gratitude for what remained, from purpose that extended beyond immediate survival to long-term rebuilding. Emma was alive. They were together. They had community. They had knowledge. They had the skills to survive and the will to help others survive. And in the frozen wasteland of post-EMP North America, that was everything that mattered. The world had ended on a Tuesday in September when every circuit board on Earth became scrap metal and the infrastructure of civilization collapsed in minutes. But humanity hadn't ended. Communities were forming, knowledge was being preserved and shared, children were growing up learning to survive, and in basements and bunkers and safe zones across the continent, people were refusing to surrender to the wasteland. They were learning that cattails could build shelters, that charcoal could filter water, that knowledge shared was survival multiplied, that community was the original technology and still the most important one. Marcus Chen, 35 years old, former Army Ranger, survivor, teacher, father, stood with his daughter Emma in the courtyard of Missoula's safe zone, teaching a group of 20 survivors how to construct emergency shelters from natural materials. His voice steady and confident, his hands demonstrating techniques, while Emma assisted with the easy competence of someone who'd absorbed the lessons and made them her own. The temperature was 28 degrees, cold but manageable, and the sky was clearing, patches of blue visible through the thinning ash clouds for the first time in weeks. The group followed his instructions carefully, weaving cattails and grasses, creating thermal shells, learning the principles that could save their lives or the lives of people they'd never met. And Marcus saw in their focused attention the same desperate hope that had driven him across hundreds of frozen miles to find his daughter. They were learning not just skills, but philosophy, that knowledge was power, that community was survival, that every person taught was another node in the network of mutual aid that would determine whether humanity's future was isolated struggle or cooperative rebuilding. Your escape plan is useless once the roads are dead, but knowledge makes every step a doorway to survival. The world had changed in ways that couldn't be reversed, but humanity's capacity to adapt, to learn, to care for each other, to refuse surrender, those constants remained. In the frozen aftermath of civilization's collapse, in the nuclear winter that would last years, in the wasteland where every day was a test of will and skill and stubborn hope, survivors were learning that the most important preparation wasn't stockpiled food or bunkers or weapons. It was knowledge, shared freely. It was community built consciously. It was the refusal to become the wasteland, the choice to remain human, the commitment to teaching the next generation that survival wasn't just biological persistence, but the preservation of everything that made humanity worth preserving. The ash continued falling, lighter now, and somewhere in the distance, smoke rose from another survivor camp, another group of people refusing to die, another seed of civilization taking root in the ruins. Marcus squeezed Emma's shoulder as she helped a woman learn the proper cattail weaving technique, and felt gratitude for the 49 days of searching that had led to this moment. For every survival technique he'd learned and taught, for every person who'd helped him along the way, for the stubborn hope that kept him walking when stopping would have been easier. The world after the pulse was hard and cold and unforgiving, but it was also full of people learning to survive together. And in that collective learning, in that shared knowledge, in that deliberate community, humanity's future was being built one cattail shelter, one purified drop of water, one taught technique at a time.